Hi everyone, my name is Dr. Matt Williams. I'm a tutor and what is known as the Access Fellow at Jesus College at the University of Oxford. So today we're going to ask and hopefully answer whether plants can think. Now, the reason for trying to answer this is because I think it's kind of interesting, and also I encourage people at the University of Oxford and prospective applicants to the university to think kind of childishly in the sort of way that, 5, 6 year olds will ask questions like, why is the sky blue and why is gold yellow? I always encourage my undergraduates at Oxford to ask big open-minded questions like this because it really gets you thinking and it gets you sort of accepting how wonderful and amazing the universe and the world around us is. So my sort of inner 5 year old asked, can plants think? Do they have thoughts? Is that a thing? What's going on there? And I'm going to try and answer it in this little mini lecture, so hopefully you enjoy. So where should we start? I mean, we've got to be quite careful with our words, right? Because a botanist, for example, would probably get pretty disturbed with words like intelligence or learning or choice or communication. Some of the attributes of thinking that we would consider to be sort of quite fundamentally human, or indeed animalistic at least, tend to depend on a central nervous system. So in us, the central nervous system is the brain, the spinal cord, and so on. And what we consider to be thinking, intelligence, and so on is connected to that. Now, given that plants don't have a central nervous system, a botanist would usually say that their behaviors can't be described as in any way thought or consciousness or any of that sort of language. So they would prefer words like adaptation to learning, because plants may adapt in an amazingly sort of clever way, but they're not sort of thinking through in the way that an animal would take the inputs and use their central nervous system to come up with an output. And so even using a word like think could be described as anthropomorphic in the sense that it's kind of human-centric. We're imposing on the plant world our way of thinking about thinking, if you see what I mean. So many botanists would say, no, you can't even say plants ever think because they don't have a central nervous system, so it's completely impossible. So let's give some examples of really interesting adaptations. So first of all, what we've got down here are what are called walking palms sometimes. These are found in the Amazon rainforest. And these are trees that, in a fairly literal sense, walk. You can see their root system is quite high above the ground. And the trees are phototropic, which is quite common in many plants. In other words, they move towards the sun, and as the trunk moves and leads towards the sun, the roots then sort of move along to catch up. Now, it's not like these canter around the forest at quite a pace. They're going pretty slowly, but if you had a time-lapse camera, they would be pretty, definitely walking around. Now, that is an adaptation. That it's not like the plants are thinking, it's sunnier over there, let's go for a little stroll, right? Because they don't have the central nervous system, but they do still have the mechanisms for adapting to their environment. And, that's basically what thinking is in animals as well, right? It's a way of adapting to an environment in a successful manner, right? Here's an even more sort of perverse example. This is neither plant nor animal. This is a lake of acid in Java, Indonesia. Now, this reacts to external stimuli because it's acid, and so almost anything will cause it to react. So at a certain sort of level of absurdity, we could say that almost anything thinks if it changes when it incurs some sort of external stimulus. So that's why we need to be very careful with concepts like thinking, not to overextend them, not to sort of stretch them to things that might be completely inappropriate. But not everybody agrees. Some would argue that actually, do you know what? Maybe we could say plants think. Maybe we could describe the adaptations that they utilize as thoughtful, as intelligent, as clever, whatever language you want to use. They would say that we are often a little bit sort of obsessed with the brain. And a philosopher called Daniel Dennett is very much of that view, that we are sort of overly interested in how central nervous systems play a role in thought, in consciousness, in intelligence, and so on. And actually, we ought to think of our own intelligence as just like any other adaptation in the animal or plant kingdom. It is a very complex, admittedly, but nonetheless just a sort of fairly predictable set of chemical, electrical, and mechanical reactions to our environment, and hence, just like anything else, it is an adaptation, a very successful adaptation. So, can plants think? Maybe, maybe not. It's up to you. Have a think. Okay. So there is, of course, a lot of pseudoscience in this sort of world. In other words, there are lots of people that use methods that can't be repeated. Now, that's one of the fundamental sins of science, is to use a method for answering your questions or hypotheses that can't be repeated. If it can't be repeated, then no one can check your homework, basically, and that's no good. Okay? So there was a particularly interesting book in this vein called The Secret Life of Plants, published in 1973. Here it is. And it made some pretty wild claims, but it did so without any replicability, without any sort of systematic method for scientific engagement with the questions, and so it's basically useless. But it was a complete sensation because the stuff it was saying was so interesting and so cool. The problem was it was all wrong. So, for example, it was claimed that plants, if subjected to a polygraph test, in other words, a lie detector test, would be able to tell truth from lie, because you would see sort of changes in the electrical signals emitted by the leaves and stuff like this. I mean, it's nonsense. It's not true. I mean, I suppose in that instance, it can be replicated. It was replicated, and it was turned out to be total nonsense. It was also claimed, again, in a way that was totally unfalsifiable, that carrots scream when you pull them out of the ground. Now, that is definitely not true. So any of you who enjoy carrots, don't worry, you're not sort of committing some sort of horrible crime when you are eating a carrot. I mean, the most outlandish claim came when a house plant was put in an identity parade in order to identify a murderer. So the house plant had been in the scene of a murder, and some bright spark thought that the plant may be able to pick out the murderer from a lineup. I mean, it's obviously silly, but the book was very popular because it kind of tapped into lots of people's imaginations that plants are maybe much more capable than we thought of. And that I would agree with. That sort of sense that we maybe denigrate plants, we don't give them enough credit for their incredible adaptations, that I'm on board with. That I think we can look again. And there has been, of course, some proper science looking into how plants think or adapt in really, really interesting ways. And of course, one of the most important scientists of all time has got to be Charles Darwin. And he was obsessed with his Tipitawitchet. Now, Tipitawitchet is the Native American name for one of these, a Venus flytrap. Now, in case you're wondering, Venus flytrap and Tipitawitchet are both rather inappropriate names for a part of the female anatomy. I won't get into it now, but I'll let you use your imagination. Anyway, the Venus flytrap is famous for being carnivorous in that it eats flies and other insects that are unfortunate enough to land on it. Now, it's not really a carnivore, because that, again, is a bit of language borrowed from the animal kingdom, but it has this absolutely astounding adaptation that it can detect when a fly has landed within its leaves. These are sort of adapted leaves, and it can then close around the fly and slowly digest it and make use of the fly as nutrition. Now, Darwin was completely blown away by this, and he fed his Tipitawitchet everything from dead and alive bugs to bits of broken glass even, and prime beef steak to see what it would do and how it would react. And he and others after him worked out that the way that the leaves close around an object is when 2 points of pressure are detected. So if a fly lands and is able to just put, say, one delicate foot on the Tipitawitchet, then it won't be gobbled up. But if it has the misfortune of putting 2 down in close succession, then it's toast. So absolutely amazing organism that it's adapted in this way, it's evolved in this way to utilize nutrition from insects is really incredible. And it just sort of demonstrates a fairly obvious point that we should give plants a lot more respect for what they are capable of. Anyway, there's also a lot of contested science. There's science which is kind of, shades of grey as to whether or not we can rely on it or not. And some really interesting work has been done by a scientist called Monica Gagliano on the touch-me-not plant, also known as Mimosa pudica. Now, part of Gagliano's research was into whether or not plants can have memories. Now, memory is a fundamental attribute of an organism with a central nervous system. Indeed, memory is one of the core points of having a central nervous system, so that you can learn from previous events and previous attempts at doing stuff, and you can take that forward into the future. It's always been thought that plants couldn't possibly have anything like a memory because they don't have a brain or a central nervous system. But what the Mimosa pudica does is that if you touch it, it sort of curls up its leaves, And so what Gagliano did was that they dropped these plants off a table about a sort of a meter high, and when doing so, because of the pressure, the leaves curled up, as you would expect. But after repeated drops, the leaves stopped curling up, was the finding. And so the conclusion was that the plant had somehow learnt and remembered that that particular drop was safe, because when it was dropped, it wasn't dropped onto a hard floor, it was dropped onto a cushion. Now, this is highly contested. Many have tried to replicate the research and have found very different results. So it's not entirely clear whether or not we can rely on any of this. But if it was true, it would be absolutely, mind-blowing that a plant could somehow remember, because where on earth would it store those memories? It's really intriguing. So something to think about, which you're capable of doing for sure. Okay, now let's have a quick refresher. What's that for? Right, these are some really interesting chemicals that plants have that we as human beings utilize for a number of different functions. But the question is, what do the plants use it for? So this is just another quick sort of romp through different adaptations that are super interesting in the plant kingdom. So cannabinoids, which are in cannabis and cause a high. Opioids, which are commonly used painkiller, but also used in street heroin and things like that. Nicotine, which is obviously in tobacco. Acetylsalicylic acid, which is the fancy schmancy way of saying willow bark, which is aspirin as a painkiller. Caffeine, tea and coffee and so on. Cyanide, which is a very sort of potent poison in the human world. Cocaine, drug, and capsaicin, which is the stuff that makes chilies hot. Now my question is, what does the plant use this stuff for? Right? Not the humans, because that's obvious. But what do plants use this stuff for? Okay, have a think. Maybe pause the video if you want to try and answer for each of these. So, if your answer was they use these chemicals to kill stuff, you were right in most cases, but not all. So cannabinoids, interestingly, protect the plant against frost and have a function in sending messages. Opioids do kill stuff. So the opioids are found in poppies, and that is an insecticide and a pesticide. Nicotine is an insecticide, so it kills stuff. Acetylsalicylic acid protects the willow from from fungi. And so again, it's a sort of a protector, fungicide in that case. Caffeine kills stuff. Cyanide, interestingly, the most lethal on the list for human beings, isn't lethal to many other things, and it's more just done for chemical signaling in crops like almonds. Almonds contain cyanide, not much, so don't worry if you like almonds. Cocaine kills stuff. Capsaicin in chilies hurts stuff. It's not lethal, as far as I'm aware, to any animal, but it only affects mammals, interestingly. So if you have ever put some seeds or nuts in your garden for the birds to enjoy, but the squirrels keep eating it, just pack it full of really hot chilies, because the birds won't be affected one jot, and the squirrels will absolutely hate it. So there you go. The more you know. Right. So moving on, let's have a look at some adaptations at the higher scale, the sort of dominance, the absolute, apex. We talk about apex predators in the animal kingdom, the tops of the food chain. What sort of species are those in plants? Because there are some that have some survival adaptations which are downright ruthless, absolutely sort of psychotic, if you like, right? Although obviously psychotic is not something that plants can be. Anyway, here is a surprising one: tomatoes. Tomatoes, like the Tipitawitchit, are capable of ingesting nutrition from insects. They are, if you like to use that term, carnivorous, although botanists don't tend to approve of that. Now, how do they do this? Well, if you've ever grown a tomato plant or seen a tomato plant, it has very furry stems, which are very pungently smelly. And what happens is that certain insects will get intoxicated by that and will fall to the base of the tomato plant and get absorbed to the roots. Genius! So it's able to feed off insects if it likes. So psychotic, there you go. This is a sequoia tree, and it is another example of an extraordinary sort of apex plant. Now, what's particularly notable about sequoia is that for their seeds to germinate, for the seed pods to open up, requires, in many cases, for there to be a forest fire. Now, this was only discovered when efforts were made to suppress forest fires in their native California. And it was noticed that for some reason the sequoia weren't propagating. But then when there were some controlled forest fires, people noticed that the pods only open when there's been a fire. And so the tree has adapted to only sort of start propagating new trees when all of the other competitor trees have been destroyed, and there's a nice sort of layer of fertile ash for them to grow in. Woo, chilling, right? So this tree wants sort of, some sort of tree genocide to occur before it is able to start growing new saplings. Still, fascinating adaptation. Again, something that we perhaps overlook the brilliance of some plants in their adaptations. Now, of course, plants say a lot about our power as well as a species, and power in sort of positive and negative senses. That the human story is totally bound up with plants. Whether or not you consider things like wood, is a fairly obvious one. Without wood, there's no fire. Without fire, there's no sort of energy dense sources of nutrition that are more portable. The human story without fire is basically unimaginable. There's yams, which were one of the first crops to be cultivated by agriculturalists, and so the dawning of civilization is connected to yams. Grains, similarly, in other parts of the world, so things like wheat and rice and millet and sorghum and so on. So those were fundamental to humans settling down and to starting to build civilizations. And then if you fast forward a long way, you've got cotton, which of course can be made into clothing, but was very important as a source of income for incredibly insidious acts of human criminality, such as the transatlantic slave trade. And then for the Industrial Revolution, things like coal. Coal's a really fascinating one. Why is coal found at a particular sort of seam underground, but not everywhere, right? Why don't we just sort of, dig down half a centimetre and find just loads of black coal everywhere? Well, it's because millions and millions of years ago, trees would fall over and most of the tree would rot, but part of it couldn't rot, and that was the lignin, which is what makes the trees really hard and tough. And then eventually a bacterium evolved that could eat the lignin. So for millions of years, trees were basically falling down and sort of partially rotting and then sort of compressing each other and just forming this really thick layer of tree stuff that eventually got compressed into coal. But then eventually a bacteria sort of worked out a way of consuming the lignin, and then it stopped. So that's why you've got a sort of layer of coal and then nothing. There you go. The more you know. Right. Of course, plants could also very well be associated with our fall in a number of ways. So although they have empowered human beings in various sort of crucial manners, if we aren't careful, they could also contribute to our downfall. And this could be with regards to, say, not taking care of invasive species. So that's where native species of plant are dominated by incoming species. So here is an example. These are some beautiful rhododendron bushes in an English garden. The problem is that the rhododendron is not native to England, and yet it loves England. So it's grown rampantly and it's killed off native species. And that, of course, damages the ecosystem because the native species of plant are part of an important web of connections with local fauna and other flora, and it can cause all sorts of havoc. So taking care of conserving native species and controlling invasive species can be very important in plants. Also, of course, things like forest clearing, which has a huge impact on climate change, in particular in places like the Amazon rainforest. And then there's things like monoculturing, which is where individual species of plants are grown in huge quantities in various parts of the world in order to exploit the crops, so things like palm oil. And that, again, damages ecosystems and biodiversity, which means that certain species of animals die, that other plants will die, and so on. So there are various ways in which, if we don't control our use of plants, our relationship with plants, it could spell the end for us. So again, we ought to be fairly sort of respectful of plants. And so I think we need to think again about stuff like intelligence and thoughtfulness and cleverness. I suppose a more sort of biologically pure way of describing these things would be as adaptations rather than thinking. But we are perhaps a little bit obsessed with brains and our own brains in particular. We tend to give ourselves a proverbial pat on the back for one of the most stunning adaptations in the animal kingdom, and rightly so. The human brain is a thing of sheer wonder. But our past, presents, and futures are completely bound up with plants, and I think we ought to have a think about whether plants can think and whether our thinking is really all that, or whether it's just like with plants chemical, biological, mechanical adaptations to stimuli. Anyway, let me know what you think in the comments, and I'll see you next time. Thanks for watching. Bye now.